Hi, I'm Claire and this is my science fiction and fantasy starter list. This is our very first Patreon voted video, so thank you to all my patrons who voted for this topic. I've selected a variety of novels, shorter works, graphic stories, things that I think would be really good entries into the genre. So let's start with my fantasy picks. First up, I want to recommend Nimona, which is illustrated and written by Noelle Stevenson. I love this story. We are in a kind of high fantasy setting with like medievalish castles and knights and dragons and magic and supervillains. Our protagonist Nimona is a shapeshifter who wants to be a sidekick to the supervillain Lord Blackheart. It's really funny but also quite moving. The illustrations are super cute. There's a lot in here about appearances and who looks like they might be a good guy or a bad guy and who actually is a good guy or a bad guy. And the story itself is not even that short. The book is about 200 pages. Because it's a graphic story, you can read it basically in one sitting, but you don't feel like you've read, you know, only the first part of something. You are getting a full, complete story. Next up, moving more towards the epic fantasy side of things, we've got Monstrous, written by Marjorie Liu and illustrated by Sana Takeda. This is set in this gloriously detailed, steampunky, art deco, high fantasy, epic fantasy kind of a world where there's just been a great war between the humans and the Arcanics, and Micah, our protagonist, is a survivor of that war. She's being hunted. She also happens to have a great big demon living inside of her that she doesn't really know how to control. My experience of reading this has been that it's quite immersive, and even though you don't necessarily know what's going on absolutely all of the time, you can still really enjoy the story, which is a skill that you need to learn if you want to get into some of the more like complex, high learning curve SFF, where a lot of more complicated SFF novels are just going to give you a bunch of stuff that happens and you have to kind of figure it out as you go along. So I think this is a good one to start you on that road. Next up, I want to recommend The Black God's Drum by P. Djeli Clark. This is an absolutely lovely, very self-contained steampunk novella, and I absolutely adored it. I think it would be really great as a starting point into steampunk. It's not your traditional steampunk set in Victorian London. It's actually set in an alternate history New Orleans. There's some cool magical and mythological elements in there with some gods that come into play, of course, as per the title. And then there is also some really fun use of language that I really enjoyed. And as I said, it's quite a self-contained story. In a genre like sci-fi and fantasy where there are a lot of massive long series, I think it's really nice in a starter list to have some more self-contained standalone things where you don't actually have to feel really daunted by a big long list of things to read after you've read this one thing. Next up, I've got another standalone. This is Signal to Noise by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is magical realism, I would say. It's one of those books where there's definitely magic, but you can't really tell what the magic is and what the rules are, and it's a little bit less defined. This is not my favorite type of fantasy, but I absolutely adored this book. I think in this context it works really well. We follow Meche, a woman who grew up in Mexico City and then moved away to, I believe, Europe to work as an adult, and she comes back to Mexico City for the funeral of her estranged father. We get all this backstory of this stuff that happened between Meche and two of her friends when she was in high school, because when she was a teenager, Meche somehow made magic happen using vinyl records, using tracks that had specific significance to her. She could make things come true that she wished. And of course, as we know in any story about the wishes that people make, be careful what you wish for. Next up is Temeraire by Naomi Novik. This was published as His Majesty's Dragon in the US, and it is the first book in the Temeraire series. This is an alternate history series where it's basically the Napoleonic Wars, but with added dragons. We follow a naval captain called Will Lawrence who accidentally bonds with the newborn baby dragon Temeraire and has to leave his post in the Navy and integrate the aerial corps as the captain of Temeraire. From there, Will comes to learn about the aerial corps and a whole bunch of politics that he didn't know about beforehand. I think this would make a really great introduction to alternate history fantasy because the structure of the book is Will himself discovering all this stuff about the dragons and the aerial corps, so it's really easy for you as the reader to be taken along and to discover things alongside Lawrence. And of course, as I've mentioned, this is the first book in the series, but this actually stands alone pretty well. So if you read it and you enjoy it, but you're not bowled over by it, you won't miss anything by reading just the first one in the series. However, if you love it and you want to read tons more of it, there's like 8 more books. Next up, I've got some more fantasy set in an alternate history of Britain, and that is Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho. We follow 2 main characters. The first is Zacharias White, who has just been named the Sorcerer Royal of England, and basically everybody in the Society of Unnatural Philosophers is really annoyed that he got the job because he's a black man. And also, Zacharias has to deal with the fact that levels of magic in England seem to be dwindling, and no one really knows why, but it's really pretty dangerous. The other main character is a young lady called Prunella Gentleman, who is in a school for young ladies where they are taught not to practice magic, but to suppress their magic. Prunella really wants to leave the school, but she can't do it because she is an orphan and she has no money and basically nothing in the world except for a suitcase that she has found that has some very interesting things in it. I absolutely love this one. I found it a really quick read, even though there are quite a lot of things in there. Aside from kind of courtly intrigues and political machinations, there are also some fairies and some dragons and things like that going on. This is the first book in a series, but it also kind of finishes fairly conclusively. The second book is coming out really soon, so I thought it would be fair enough to mention an unfinished series if the next book is coming out quite soon. And finally, for fantasy, I've got The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. This is potentially a bit more of an intermediate pick than a beginner pick. However, it is gorgeous epic fantasy. We follow Yena, a young woman who is very distantly related to the royal family of the 100,000 Kingdoms, but she is one day, out of the blue, summoned to the palace to be told that she's going to actually be entered into the line of succession, the direct line of succession. And it's not a fun time because there are a lot of other people in the line of succession who do not want Yena to be there. There are also some all-powerful gods that have been reduced and enslaved to do the bidding of the royal family. They are not happy about the state of things. They are very angry. Yena has to deal not only with all the intrigue at the court, but also with these furious enslaved gods. I love this story. I think it is well worth the maybe effort that it takes to get into it. Moving on to science fiction, my first pick is Descender. This is written by Jeff Lemire and illustrated by Dustin Nguyen, and I absolutely adore this book. So this is a book about robots, specifically this little guy robot here called Tim21, who was a companion robot to a little boy, except that a long time ago something really bad happened to the planet that they were on, and Tim21 went into shutdown for a really long time, and when he wakes up everybody on the planet is dead. Like a lot of stories about robots, and specifically stories about robots that are made to look and act like humans, there is a lot in here about what it means to be human and what it means to be a robot and a companion robot and all that kind of stuff. But also, this is a kind of epic space opera story that is on a massive scale. You get to meet loads of different types of aliens, and you get to see how people live on different planets. Next up, I want to recommend Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a novella that is also taking place in space, but it is a little bit less of an epic sprawling space opera thing. It is more focused on our main character Binti, a young woman who is the first of her people to be accepted to Umza University, a college that's off planet, so she has to sneak away to a spaceship to get off of Earth so she can go study at Umza University. She has a brilliant mind for math, but actually the story goes a lot more into language and into communicating with aliens that aren't like us and what that might look like. And of course, I love language-based stories, so this was going to be in my wheelhouse. This is a novella, it reads really quickly, and there are 2 more novellas in this series if you'd like to read more. Next up is On a Red Station Drifting by Aliette de Bodard. This is a sci-fi novella that takes place on a space station. We follow 2 point of view characters, a woman called Lynn who was a magistrate on another planet, but that planet got invaded by rebels and she escaped, and now she is seeking refuge on this station because it is run by members of her extended family. One of these people is Quyen, the administrator for the station, who does not get along with Lynn at all. However, she also has other issues, like the fact that the mind that is running the station seems to be faltering, and that shouldn't happen at all. What I really loved about this story is that it was science fiction that focuses heavily on culture and mythology. So if that sounds like your thing, this is a novella, it's pretty quick to read, and it is also within Aliette de Bodard's Zuya universe. There are a lot more linked, like short stories, novelettes, novellas that are in that same world if you are interested in reading more. Next up we have The Martian by Andy Weir. This is of course the story of Mark Watney, an astronaut on a Mars mission who gets accidentally left behind on Mars and has to science his way out of it. In general, I quite like survival stories, so this worked really well for me. And I also think as far as hard sci-fi goes, you know, books and stories with loads and loads of actual science on the page where you have to read through bits about physics and math and biology and botany and stuff, it works pretty well. It reads really quickly, it's not too confusing, and of course because there is a movie and the movie itself is pretty great, you can go into this one having seen the movie as a kind of like, let me see where this came from kind of thing, or you can talk people into reading it based on the movie as well. Next up I have The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. We follow the crew of the spaceship Wayfarer as they make their way to a small angry planet very far away to basically like punch a hole into space to do like a short wormhole trade route. So they're basically space truckers. And what I think makes this book a really good starter book is that it reads really episodically. So you can read basically 1 chapter at a time and get like a mini arc within that chapter. I also really love the world building in this series. All of the alien species that are described in the book are really great, really interesting, really different from each other, which is quite important. Also, this is technically the first book in a series, but it reads as a standalone. The other books in the series are related to it, but they're not direct sequels, so you can read it and not feel like you necessarily have to read more, but I think you'll probably want to read more because it is great. Next up we've got The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. This is a post-apocalyptic zombie book, and I know some people are over zombies, but I still love them and I adore this book, and I think it's a really good like starter into the post-apocalyptic survival genre because we follow our main character Melanie, who doesn't know what's going on for a lot of the beginning of the book and is learning little by little what's happened to the world and what she has to do with it, and we get to learn that with her. I think this book has one of the best endings of like any book, but especially in terms of how you come to the end of any narrative where it's the end of the world. Like, how do we progress? I think this book has a spectacular ending. I love it. There is also a movie which is really, really good, and I would recommend seeing if you can find it. And finally, The Collapsing Empire by John Scalzi. We are in a universe where planets are linked to each other via something called the flow, and basically the flow is collapsing in on itself, and soon there will not be any more faster than light travel. So all of the planets in this empire, which is called the interdependency, will soon not be able to depend on each other at all, because they'll be completely cut off. And we follow a bunch of characters as they learn this information and deal with this information. One of the characters is a young scientist whose father has been studying this phenomenon for years and years and years, and finally come to some conclusions that he wants his son to take to the emperor in the capital planet. We also follow the emperor as she gets this information and has to deal with that, as well as dealing with some plots and intrigue and backstabbing from some of the major trade families that are vying for power. Another main character that I absolutely loved was the daughter of one of the main trade families, who has an absolutely potty mouth and is a badass and becomes embroiled in this whole thing. I don't want to give too much away, but this is a fun, adventure-y page-turner of a book, and I would highly recommend it. Now, it is the first in a series, and it is not a standalone. However, the next book is coming out really shortly, so I don't feel too bad about giving you this recommendation. I had a lot of difficulty picking one Scalzi book for this list and no more, but in the end I had to pick The Collapsing Empire because that is the one that I'm currently the most excited about, and ultimately I really think the best way to start reading in any genre is to find really exciting stuff and then give those a go. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. This list was quite an undertaking to put together. If you have any suggestion for any other books that would be good entry-level science fiction and fantasy picks, please do leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to see more from me, you can check out a previous video on screen right now. And if you haven't yet, please hit the subscribe button that's on my face for a new video from me every week. I've been Claire, thanks so much for watching, and see you soon.